The day I watched my children walk away from me was the day I decided to stop pretending. For 40 years, I had lived in a carefully crafted illusion of financial struggle, clipping coupons at my kitchen table, wearing clothes from discount stores, and driving a 15-year-old sedan with fading paint. I had maintained the perfect disguise of a widow barely making ends meet. But as I stood in my modest living room, watching through worn curtains as my son Jason and daughter Melissa drove away after announcing they were selling my home for my own good, I felt something inside me finally break. The pretense I had, maintained for 4 decades since their father passed, was about to end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you, I'm Margaret Wilson, and this is the story of how I lived a double life that ended with a revelation none of my children ever saw coming. It began in the spring of 1983, when my husband Richard died unexpectedly of a heart attack at just 45 years old. I was 42 with 3 children, Jason, 17, Melissa, 15, and Kevin, 12. The shock of Richard's death was devastating enough, but what my children never knew was that the night before he died, Richard had finally succeeded. After years of careful investments, patents from his engineering work, and strategic real estate purchases, we had become quietly wealthy. "Margaret, we did it," he had whispered that night, showing me the latest portfolio statement. "The kids will never have to worry about money a day in their lives." The irony of timing was almost too cruel to bear. The next day, he was gone, and I was left with not just grief, but a decision that would shape the next 4 decades of my life. I still remember sitting in Mr. Goldstein's office a week after the funeral, our family attorney of 20 years, as he explained the extent of our wealth. "Margaret, the estate is worth approximately $7 million, and that's a conservative estimate," he said, sliding the paperwork across his mahogany desk. "Richard's investments were remarkably prescient. The tech stocks alone have tripled in the last 2 years." I stared at the numbers, thinking about my 3 teenagers at home who were still struggling to process their father's death. They had grown up in comfortable but modest circumstances. Richard and I had always lived below our means, teaching our children the value of hard work and frugality even as our hidden wealth grew. "What would happen," I asked slowly, "if the children knew about all this money now?" Mr. Goldstein removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "That's entirely your decision, Margaret. Richard left everything to you with complete discretion." I thought about Jason, already talking about dropping out of school because what's the point? I thought about Melissa's recent rebellious streak and hanging around kids who seemed more interested in partying than anything else. I thought about young Kevin, impressionable and looking to his older siblings for guidance. "I don't want them to know," I said finally. "Not yet. Not until they're ready." Mr. Goldstein nodded. "We can set up a structure where the assets remain invisible to them. You would control everything." And so my deception began, not out of malice or distrust, but from a mother's hope that her children would develop character, work ethic, and appreciation for life's true values without the shortcut that sudden wealth often provides. I returned to our modest 3-bedroom home in Lakeside, a middle-class neighborhood in Millfield, Ohio, and told my children a carefully constructed half-truth, that their father had left us financially secure, with a small life insurance policy, but that we would need to be careful with money. I returned to my job as a high school librarian, explaining that we needed the health insurance and steady income. In those early years, the deception was relatively easy to maintain. The children were consumed with their own grief and adolescent lives. The small house we'd always lived in remained our home, though I secretly paid off the mortgage. The vacations we took were modest, the cars we drove were practical, and the lifestyle we maintained was solidly middle class. What they didn't know was that every month, I transferred substantial sums into separate investment accounts. Richard's patents continued to generate royalties. His early investment in Microsoft and Apple grew exponentially, and the commercial properties he had purchased in what were once struggling areas of Columbus began appreciating as the city expanded. I watched carefully as my children navigated early adulthood. Jason struggled through college, more interested in parties than studies, but eventually graduated and found work in sales. Melissa married young to Thomas, a charming man with big dreams but questionable financial sense. Kevin, my youngest, showed the most promise, diligent in school and passionate about becoming a doctor. Throughout their 20s, I provided modest help when needed. A down payment for Jason's first small house disguised as savings I'd put aside from your father's insurance, helping with Melissa's wedding while insisting on a reasonable budget, contributing to Kevin's medical school expenses while encouraging him to take reasonable loans like everyone else has to. The true test of my approach came when they reached their 30s. Jason's sales career flourished, then floundered, as he prioritized material acquisitions over financial security. Melissa and Thomas cycled through financial crises, always with a new business idea that needed just a little more capital. Kevin finished medical school but complained constantly about his student debt, despite his growing income as a cardiologist. Throughout these years, I maintained my modest librarian's life, even after retirement. My small pension and careful savings were my explained income. Meanwhile, my actual net worth had grown to nearly $30 million through careful management and the tech boom of the late 90s. No one knew except Mr. Goldstein and later his son, David, who took over the practice when his father retired. "Are you ever going to tell them?" David asked during one of our annual reviews, as we looked at the trust funds I had secretly established for each of my grandchildren's education. I sighed, thinking of how Jason had recently bought a boat he couldn't afford, how Melissa had called just last week asking for a loan to cover their mortgage after Thomas's latest business venture failed, and how Kevin complained about not being able to buy a vacation home while simultaneously renovating his kitchen with imported marble. "When they're ready," I said, the same answer I'd given for nearly 3 decades. "When they understand value beyond the dollar amount." I didn't realize then that my test would come in a way I never expected, or that "when they're ready" would transform into "when they showed me who they truly were." The first sign of trouble came just after my 75th birthday. I had maintained my health well, still living independently in the same house where I'd raised my family. But a fall in the garden resulted in a broken wrist, and suddenly my children were having concerned conversations just outside my hospital room door. "Mom can't keep living alone in that old house," I overheard Jason say. "It's too much maintenance, and it's not even worth that much in that neighborhood." "The medical bills are going to start piling up as she gets older," Melissa added. "Medicare doesn't cover everything, and you know she's too proud to admit if she's struggling financially." "We should look into assisted living options," Kevin suggested. "Something basic that her pension and Social Security can cover." I lay in the hospital bed, my wrist throbbing, listening to my children discuss my future as if I were already gone. Or worse, as if I were a burden to be managed. Not once did any of them suggest helping financially with my care if needed. Not once did they consider what I might want. After returning home, the suggestions became more insistent. Brochures for affordable senior apartments appeared on my coffee table. Kevin sent links to Medicare supplement insurance, since we know money is tight. Jason started talking about how much I could get for my house in this market, even with the needed repairs. I deflected their suggestions, watching carefully to see if any of them would offer genuine help, not in managing me, but in supporting what I wanted, to stay in my home. "Mom, be reasonable," Melissa said during Sunday dinner, 6 months after my fall. "This house is falling apart. You're on a fixed income, and none of us has the extra money to help with repairs or in-home care if you need it later." I looked around the table at my 3 adult children. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jason, now 57, with his designer watch and country club membership, despite his complaints about business being tough these days. Melissa, 55, with her salon-perfect hair and third set of kitchen renovations despite the business failures. Kevin, 52, lamenting his children's college expenses while planning a second European vacation that year. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked quietly. They exchanged glances before Jason spoke. "We think you should sell the house. The market's decent right now, and you could use the money for a small apartment or assisted living. We've found some nice places in Westbrook that would be within your budget." "And if I don't want to move?" Kevin leaned forward, using his doctor voice, the one I imagined he used with difficult patients. "Mom, this isn't really optional. You're getting older, and we're worried about you. We've actually already contacted a realtor to get an assessment." "You did what?" My voice was barely a whisper. "It's for your own good," Melissa added quickly. "Carol is coming by tomorrow. She's very experienced with downsizing seniors." I looked at each of them, these adults I had raised, now sitting in my dining room telling me they had decided to sell my home without even consulting me. In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity what my 40-year experiment had produced. 3 entitled individuals who saw their aging mother as a problem to solve, rather than a person to respect. "I see," I said finally. "And have you decided where to move me to?" "There's a nice assisted living facility in Westbrook," Jason said, relief evident in his voice now that I seemed to be accepting their decision. "Basic, but clean, and they have a space available next month. Your house sale should cover about 5 years there, and by then..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. By then, they assumed I would either run out of money or die. "I understand," I said, folding my napkin carefully. "I'd like some time to process this. Could you all come back next Saturday? I'll have an answer then." They left that evening satisfied, already discussing how to divide up the furniture they didn't think would fit in my new cozy apartment. None of them offered to help clear the dishes. After they drove away, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped with countless homework assignments, where I'd paid bills and clipped coupons for show, where I'd maintained the fiction of financial struggle for 40 years. I realized my experiment had failed in the worst possible way. My children had not developed generosity, compassion, or understanding. Instead, they saw me as nothing more than a financial liability. That night, I made a phone call that would change everything. "David, it's Margaret Wilson. I think it's time to tell them the truth. Can you come to my house next Saturday at noon and bring all the paperwork?" The week that followed was surreal. The realtor, Carol, came and walked through my home with a critical eye, talking about updating this outdated kitchen and clearing out all this clutter, as if my treasured books and mementos were garbage. I nodded politely and offered her tea. Jason called twice to ask if I'd started packing yet. Melissa sent links to furniture for your new compact living space. Kevin left a message saying he'd found a budget-friendly option for moving my things. Not once did any of them ask how I felt about leaving the home where I'd lived for nearly 50 years, where every corner held memories of Richard and our life together. Saturday arrived bright and clear. I dressed carefully in one of my typical outfits: simple slacks, a cardigan I'd visibly mended at the elbow, sensible shoes. My camouflage for 4 decades. I prepared coffee and set out the cookies I knew my children liked, then waited. David Goldstein arrived first, precisely at 11:30 as we had arranged, carrying a leather briefcase filled with the documentation of my secret life. He was in his 50s now, with the same kind eyes as his father. "Are you certain about this, Margaret?" he asked as we sat in my living room. "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied, feeling strangely calm. It's time they knew exactly who their mother is. My children arrived together at noon, walking into my house with the confidence of people who believed they were taking charge of a situation. The shock on their faces when they saw David sitting with his briefcase was immediate. "Mom, who's this?" Jason asked, instantly suspicious. "This is David Goldstein, my attorney," I said pleasantly. "Please, everyone sit down. We have something important to discuss before any real estate decisions are made." They exchanged confused glances but settled onto the couch across from us. I nodded to David, who opened his briefcase and began distributing folders. "Before we begin," I said, looking at each of my children, "I want you to know that what you learned today may be shocking, and you may feel many things, confusion, perhaps anger. But I ask that you listen completely before responding." I took a deep breath, and after 40 years of pretense, I finally began to tell the truth. When your father died, he left us not just financially secure, but wealthy. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Jason finally asked. "Dad was an engineer. We always lived." He gestured around at my modest living room. "Like this." "Your father was much more than just an engineer," I explained, nodding to David, who handed each of them a thick folder. "He was an inventor with multiple patents, an early investor in several technology companies that are now household names, and a very shrewd real estate investor." "This can't be right," Kevin said, flipping through pages of account statements and property holdings. "If this were true, why would you live like this?" He looked around with new eyes at the worn furniture, the outdated kitchen visible through the doorway, the 15-year-old television in the corner. "That's what we're here to discuss," I said calmly. "David, could you please explain the current status of my estate?" David cleared his throat, professional and precise. "Mrs. Wilson's current net worth is approximately $47 million, conservatively estimated. This includes the original assets left by Richard Wilson, which have been carefully managed and have grown substantially over the past 40 years, along with Margaret's own astute investments." Melissa's folder slipped from her fingers, papers scattering across the floor. $47 million? She whispered. "That's impossible." "I assure you it's quite accurate," David continued. "The portfolio includes significant holdings in technology stocks, a commercial real estate portfolio primarily in Columbus and Cincinnati, intellectual property royalties from your father's patents, and various other investments. All assets are held in trusts and LLCs structured for maximum tax efficiency and privacy." "But you've been working as a librarian all these years," Jason said accusingly. "Clipping coupons, shopping sales, driving that old car." "Yes," I said simply. "I have." "But why?" Kevin demanded, his voice rising. "Why would you pretend to struggle financially when you had all this money? Do you know what we've gone through? The student loans, the mortgages, the stress of raising our own children without help?" I looked at my youngest son, seeing the entitlement that had grown in him over the years. "I didn't pretend to struggle, Kevin. I chose to live simply. There's a difference. And as for help, I paid for half of your medical school tuition anonymously through a scholarship you thought you'd earned. I provided the down payment for each of your first homes. I established college funds for each of my grandchildren that will fully cover their education." Their faces registered shock as they processed this information. "You've been lying to us our entire adult lives," Melissa said, tears forming in her eyes. "Why would you do this to us? I wanted you to develop character, work ethic, and appreciation for what truly matters in life," I explained. "Your father and I agreed long before he died that sudden wealth can stunt moral development. We wanted you to become the kind of people who would use wealth wisely and compassionately." "So this was some kind of sick test?" Jason demanded, anger replacing his initial shock. "Not initially," I admitted. At first, it was protection. You were teenagers when your father died, struggling with grief. Introducing sudden wealth at that vulnerable time seemed unwise. Later, as I watched you grow into adults, I kept waiting for the right moment, looking for signs that you understood money doesn't define value. And you never saw those signs, Kevin said flatly. It wasn't a question. I saw glimpses, I said, truthfully. In your early passion for medicine, Kevin. In your love for teaching, Melissa, before you gave it up to help with Thomas's business ventures. In your dedication to your children, Jason, even while pursuing material success. I leaned forward, looking at each of them. But last week, when you decided to sell my home without my consent, when you discussed my future as if I were a financial burden rather than your mother, I realized something important. You needed to know the truth not because you'd passed some test, but because you'd shown me exactly who you've become. The room fell silent again as they processed my words. David sat quietly beside me, a supportive presence as my children struggled with their emotions. So what happens now? Melissa finally asked, her voice small. I gestured to the folders they held. If you continue reading, you'll find that I've prepared 3 options for each of you. They turned pages with trembling hands as I explained. Option 1, I continue, as I have been, living my life as I choose, and you continue yours. My wealth remains mine to manage until my death, at which point each of you will receive a modest inheritance of $1 million. The bulk of my estate will go to the charitable foundation I established 15 years ago. I saw their faces tighten at the word modest, confirming what I already suspected about their priorities. Option 2, I provide each of you with a one-time gift of $2 million now. You use it as you see fit, with no further expectations of inheritance. Again, the remainder eventually goes to the foundation. Their expressions shifted to calculations. Was $2 million now better than waiting for $1 million later? Option 3 is more complicated, I continued. Each of you spends 1 year working directly with me at my foundation. You learn how wealth can be used to create meaningful change. You understand the responsibility that comes with financial privilege. After that year, we reassess. If you've genuinely engaged with the work, you'll each receive significant ongoing involvement with the family wealth, including meaningful inheritance and roles within the foundation if you desire them. You're still testing us, Jason said, bitterly. Dangling your money like a carrot. No, Jason, I said firmly. I'm offering you an opportunity to prove to yourselves, not to me, what kind of people you truly are. Money simply makes us more of who we already are. I'm giving you the chance to discover who that might be. And if we want nothing to do with your manipulative games? Kevin asked, his doctor's composure cracking to reveal raw anger. If we walk away right now? That is absolutely your right, I said calmly. Option 1 would apply automatically. I would continue my life. You would continue yours. And we would determine whether our relationship could heal from this revelation. I still don't understand, Melissa said, tears flowing freely now. All these years when we struggled, when Thomas and I nearly lost our house, when we couldn't afford braces for Emily without payment plans. You had millions just sitting there? How could you watch us struggle? I felt a deep sadness as I looked at my daughter. Melissa, I helped in ways you never knew. The mysterious scholarship that paid for Emily's braces in full? That was me. The lucky break when your mortgage. Company suddenly agreed to modification during your worst financial crisis? That was me working behind the scenes. But why secretly? She demanded. Why not just help us openly? Because money given without understanding its purpose creates dependence, not growth, I explained. I've seen it happen to families, destroyed by wealth without wisdom. I wanted more for all of you. So instead, you've destroyed us with secrets and manipulation, Kevin said, standing abruptly. Congratulations, Mom. Your experiment is complete. I watched as he stormed toward the door, pausing only to look back at his siblings. Are you coming? Jason stood without a word, following his brother. Only Melissa hesitated, looking between the folder in her hands and my face. Everything in those documents is accurate and legally binding, David said quietly. Take time to review them carefully before making any decisions. Melissa finally stood, clutching the folder to her chest. I need to think, she said, not meeting my eyes before following her brothers out the door. I sat in the sudden silence of my living room, listening to their cars start and drive away. The confrontation had gone largely as I expected, yet the pain was still sharp. David placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Are you all right, Margaret? Something more than consumers of wealth? My phone remained silent that night, and the next, and the next. A week passed with no word from any of my children. I continued my routine, tending my garden, volunteering at the library, meeting with the directors of my foundation. But now I drove my new car, the first luxury vehicle I'd allowed myself in decades. I made appointments with contractors about the home renovations I'd long postponed for the sake of appearances. I was no longer pretending. On the 10th day after my revelation, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Melissa standing alone on my porch, her face showing signs of sleepless nights. May I come in? She asked quietly. And so began the next chapter of our story, one no longer built on necessary deception, but on the harder path of truth. I invited Melissa in, noticing immediately how her eyes darted around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps she was. When you believe someone is poor, you see their possessions, I nodded slowly. I've had 40 years to prepare for this day. They've had 40 minutes. They need time. Do you think they'll come around? He asked, gathering his papers. I looked out the window at the garden Richard and I had planted decades ago, still blooming despite years of Ohio winters. I hope so. But even if they don't, the truth is finally in the open. Whatever happens next will at least be honest. After David left, I walked through my home, the home my children had planned to sell out from under me, and felt a strange lightness despite the emotional storm that had just occurred. For the first time in 40 years, I was fully myself, no longer maintaining a careful fiction for the sake of a grand experiment in character building. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate at my kitchen table, wondering what my children were doing, what they were saying to each other and their spouses. Were they angry, confused, calculating? Would they choose money now, money later, or the chance to become something more than consumers of wealth? My phone remained silent that night and the next and the next. A week passed with no word from any of my children. I continued my routine, tending my garden, volunteering at the library, meeting with the directors of my foundation. But now I drove my new car, the first luxury vehicle I'd allowed myself in decades. I made appointments with contractors about the home renovations I'd long postponed for the sake of appearances. I was no longer pretending. On the 10th day after my revelation, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Melissa standing alone on my porch, her face showing signs of sleepless nights. May I come in? She asked quietly. And so began the next chapter of our story, one no longer built on necessary deception, but on the harder path of truth. I invited Melissa in, noticing immediately how her eyes darted around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps she was. When you believe someone is poor, you see their possessions through that lens. When you discover they're wealthy, everything looks different, even if nothing has changed. Would you like some tea? I offered, falling back on the hospitality that had always been genuine, regardless of my financial pretense. Melissa nodded, and followed me to the kitchen. I felt her watching as I moved efficiently around the space, heating water in the electric kettle I'd used for years. "This kitchen," she said finally, tracing a finger along the worn Formica countertop. "You could have remodeled it 100 times over." "I could have," I agreed, placing a tea bag in each mug. "But it works perfectly well, and I never cared much for keeping up appearances." She laughed suddenly, a sharp sound without humor. That's the understatement of the century. I placed her tea in front of her and sat across the table, the same positions we had occupied countless times over decades of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. This time, no pretense stood between us. "I've been thinking about nothing else for days," Melissa admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I've gone through every emotion: anger, betrayal, confusion, even a bizarre sense of relief that somehow explains so many things that never quite made sense. Such as?" I prompted gently. "How you never seemed truly worried about money, even when you talked about being careful with it. How you always had perfect credit despite your limited income. The way you would sometimes make comments about wealthy people that seemed to hold more insight than someone who'd never had money would know." She shook her head. I should have seen it. "We see what we expect to see," I said. "That's true for everyone." "Thomas thinks I should take the $2 million and run," she said suddenly. "Jason and Kevin are leaning that way too. They say, you've manipulated us enough, and we should just take what we can get now." I nodded, unsurprised. "And what do you think?" She stared into her tea as if divining answers from the ripples. "I think I want to understand. Really understand. Not just the what of all this, but the why." For the next 3 hours, Melissa and I talked more honestly than we had in decades. I explained in detail my decision process after Richard died, shared my observations of each of them as they grew through adulthood, and admitted my own doubts and regrets about the path I had chosen. "There were so many times I almost told you," I confessed. "When Emily needed braces and you were working extra shifts to save up, when Thomas's business failed the second time, and you sold your wedding ring to cover the mortgage." "You knew about that?" Melissa whispered. I nodded slowly. "I've had 40 years to prepare for this day. They've had 40 minutes. They need time." "Do you think they'll come around?" he asked, gathering his papers. I looked out the window at the garden Richard and I had planted decades ago, still blooming despite years of Ohio winters. "I hope so. But even if they don't, the truth is finally in the open. Whatever happens next will at least be honest." After David left, I walked through my home, the home my children had planned to sell out from under me, and felt a strange lightness despite the emotional storm that had just occurred. For the first time in 40 years, I was fully myself, no longer maintaining a careful fiction for the sake of a grand experiment in character building. That evening, I made a simple dinner and ate at my kitchen table, wondering what my children were doing, what they were saying to each other and their spouses. Were they angry, confused, calculating? Would they choose money now, money later, or the chance to become something more than consumers of wealth? My phone remained silent that night and the next and the next. A week passed with no word from any of my children. I continued my routine, tending my garden, volunteering at the library, meeting with the directors of my foundation. But now I drove my new car, the first luxury vehicle I'd allowed myself in decades. I made appointments with contractors about the home renovations I'd long postponed for the sake of appearances. I was no longer pretending. On the 10th day after my revelation, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Melissa standing alone on my porch, her face showing signs of sleepless nights. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. And so began the next chapter of our story, one no longer built on necessary deception, but on the harder path of truth. I invited Melissa in, noticing immediately how her eyes darted around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. Perhaps she was. When you believe someone is poor, you see their possessions through that lens. When you discover they're wealthy, everything looks different, even if nothing has changed. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, falling back on the hospitality that had always been genuine, regardless of my financial pretense. Melissa nodded and followed me to the kitchen. I felt her watching as I moved efficiently around the space, heating water in the electric kettle I'd used for years. "This kitchen," she said finally, tracing a finger along the worn Formica countertop. "You could have remodeled it 100 times over." "I could have," I agreed, placing a tea bag in each mug. "But it works perfectly well, and I never cared much for keeping up appearances." She laughed suddenly, a sharp sound without humor. "That's the understatement of the century." I placed her tea in front of her and sat across the table, the same positions we had occupied countless times over decades of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. This time, no pretense stood between us. "I've been thinking about nothing else for days," Melissa admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I've gone through every emotion: anger, betrayal, confusion, even a bizarre sense of relief that somehow explains so many things that never quite made sense." "Such as?" I prompted gently. "How you never seemed truly worried about money, even when you talked about being careful with it. How you always had perfect credit despite your limited income. The way you would sometimes make comments about wealthy people that seemed to hold more insight than someone who'd never had money would know." She shook her head. "I should have seen it." "We see what we expect to see," I said. "That's true for everyone." "Thomas thinks I should take the $2 million and run," she said suddenly. "Jason and Kevin are leaning that way too. They say, 'You've manipulated us enough, and we should just take what we can get now.'" I nodded, unsurprised. "And what do you think?" She stared into her tea as if divining answers from the ripples. "I think I want to understand. Really understand. Not just the what of all this, but the why." For the next 3 hours, Melissa and I talked more honestly than we had in decades. I explained in detail my decision process after Richard died, shared my observations of each of them as they grew through adulthood, and admitted my own doubts and regrets about the path I had chosen. "There were so many times I almost told you," I confessed, "when Emily needed braces and you were working extra shifts to save up. When Thomas's business failed the second time and you sold your wedding ring to cover the mortgage." "You knew about that?" Melissa whispered. "I know most things about your financial history," I acknowledged. "I've kept careful tabs on all of you, ready to step in if true disaster threatened, trying to discern the difference between struggle that builds character and hardship that breaks spirit." "But who made you the judge of that line?" she asked, the question holding more curiosity now than accusation. "I was your mother," I said simply. "Imperfect, perhaps even wrong, but acting out of love and hope for what you might become." I paused, then added, "And by the time I realized my approach might have been flawed, you were all deeply established in your lives, your values, your understanding of money. Revealing the truth then seemed like it might do more harm than good." "Until we tried to sell your house," Melissa concluded. "Until you showed me that you saw my aging as a burden rather than a phase of life deserving dignity and agency," I corrected gently. "The house was just a symptom." Melissa flinched, but didn't argue the point. "So, what happens now?" I reached for the folder she had brought back with her. "Have you decided which option you're considering?" She hesitated. "I'm interested in the foundation work, option 3. But I have questions." "Of course." "What exactly does the foundation do, and what would working there involve?" I smiled, feeling the first genuine spark of hope that something good might come from my revelation. "Let me show you." I led Melissa to my home office, a small room off the living room that had always been simple but functional. Now, I unlocked a drawer in my desk that my children had never seen, opened and removed a laptop far newer and more expensive than anything they'd seen me use. "This is Margaret Wilson without the financial camouflage," I said, opening the computer and entering my password. I pulled up a slideshow of images, community centers being built, scholarship recipients graduating, affordable housing developments, environmental restoration projects, medical clinics in rural areas. "The Wilson Foundation has been operating for 15 years, I explained as Melissa watched with widening eyes. "We focus on sustainable community development, educational opportunity, and healthcare access in underserved areas. We currently have projects in 8 states and 4 countries. "You run all this?" she asked incredulously. "I'm the founder and board chair," I corrected. "We have a professional staff of 22, led by an exceptional executive director named Sophia Chen. My role is strategic direction and major decisions." I showed her organizational charts, impact reports, and financial statements. Unlike the personal financial documents David had provided, these told the story not of wealth accumulated, but of resources deployed with purpose. "This senior housing development in Appalachia," I said, pointing to images of a beautiful complex surrounded by gardens, "provides affordable, dignified housing for elderly residents with limited means. The kind of place you and your brothers would have put me if I truly had been the financially struggling widow I pretended to be." Melissa had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "Nothing like the place we found." "Because dignity shouldn't depend on wealth," I said firmly. "Option 3 would involve you working directly with our housing initiative, learning every aspect from property acquisition to resident services." As evening approached, Melissa was still asking questions, engaged and thoughtful in ways I hadn't seen in years. When she finally prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "What if Jason and Kevin don't choose option 3? I smiled sadly. "That's their decision to make. This isn't about forcing anyone's choice, just offering clarity about consequences. And if I'm the only one, then you'll be the only one to truly understand what your father and I built, and why." I touched her cheek gently. "Take time to think, Melissa. Discuss it with Thomas. This isn't a decision to make from emotion alone." After she left, I made myself a simple dinner and reflected on our conversation. It had gone better than I dared hope, though I harbored no illusions about an easy resolution. One tentatively interested child was a beginning, not an ending. The next day, I received a tersely worded email from Kevin, formally requesting the $2 million immediate distribution. 2 days later, a similar message came from Jason. Neither contained personal messages, just legal language clearly copied from the documents David had provided. I responded to each with equal formality, confirming receipt of their decisions, and explaining that David would contact them within the week to arrange the transfers and necessary paperwork. I didn't allow myself to dwell on disappointment. They had made their choices as adults with free will, exactly as the options had allowed. A week later, Melissa called. "I've decided," she said without preamble. "I want option 3. I want to understand." "I'm glad," I said, meaning it deeply. "When would you like to begin?" "Is next Monday too soon?" Thomas and I have discussed it extensively. He's skeptical but supportive. We arranged for her orientation at the Foundation's main office in Columbus, a modest space that belied the scope of work conducted there. I notified Sophia, my executive director, who had known for years this day might eventually come. Meanwhile, David confirmed that the transfers to Kevin and Jason had been completed. The $2 million each had asked for, more money than most people see in a lifetime, was now theirs to use as they saw fit. I found myself wondering what they would do with it. whether it would bring them the satisfaction they seemed to believe it would. On Melissa's first day at the foundation, I deliberately stayed away, giving her space to form her own impressions without my influence. Sophia would guide her introduction to our work, explaining her year-long learning journey through every department and project area. That evening, Melissa called, her voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, this is incredible. The affordable housing program alone. Do you know they've housed over 2,000 seniors in the past decade? And the scholarship initiative? For first-generation college students. Why didn't you ever tell us? Would you have understood if I had?" I asked gently. "Before now?" Her silence was answer enough. The weeks that followed established a new routine. Melissa worked at the foundation 4 days a week, diving into project evaluations, site visits, and strategic planning sessions. We had dinner together each Wednesday, discussing what she was learning, her growing understanding of impact investing, grant evaluation, and community-centered development. "I knew nothing about any of this," she admitted during one such dinner. "I thought philanthropy was just rich people putting their names on hospital wings." "That's charity," I corrected. "Important, but different from systemic change work." As I watched my daughter absorb the complexities of thoughtful wealth deployment, I began to see glimpses of the person she might have become had circumstances been different, curious, compassionate, driven by purpose rather than acquisition. 2 months into Melissa's foundation work, Kevin called unexpectedly. His voice sounded strained, lacking its usual confidence. "I was wondering if we could talk," he said. "In person." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. When he arrived, I was struck by subtle changes in his appearance. His designer watch was gone, his expensive suit replaced by more casual attire. "I made a mistake," he said after our coffee arrived, looking down at the table rather than meeting my eyes. "With the money." "What happened?" I asked, keeping judgment from my voice. "I invested most of it in a medical technology startup. A colleague recommended. They declared bankruptcy last week. The SEC is investigating potential fraud." He finally looked up. "I've lost nearly everything." I absorbed this information calmly. "I'm sorry to hear that, Kevin. That must be very difficult." "Aren't you going to say I told you so?" he asked bitterly. "Isn't this exactly what your manipulation was supposed to prevent?" "I didn't want to prevent you from making mistakes," I clarified. "I wanted you to develop the wisdom to learn from them. There's a difference." Kevin stirred his coffee absently, avoiding my eyes. "Is it true what Melissa said? That there's still a place for me in this foundation thing?" I considered my son carefully. At 52, his face showed new lines of worry that hadn't been there before his investment disaster. The arrogant cardiologist who had tried to dictate my living arrangements was now sitting across from me humbled, perhaps for the first time, in his adult life. "The option remains open," I confirmed. "Though I should be clear, it's not about getting your money back, Kevin. It's about understanding what money is truly for." "I thought I knew," he said quietly. "Status, security, freedom. Isn't that what everyone wants?" "Those are outcomes, not purposes," I replied. "The foundation work is about purpose." Kevin looked up, a flash of his old defensiveness returning. "And you get to define that purpose?" "No," I smiled, slightly. "That's what the year of working there helps you discover for yourself." We talked for another hour. Unlike my conversation with Melissa, Kevin asked fewer questions about the foundation itself and more about my deception, how I had maintained it, whether I had ever felt guilty, if I had secretly judged them all these years. His wounded pride was still very much at the forefront. "I need time to think," he said finally, preparing to leave. "Take all the time you need," I replied. "The door remains open." 2 weeks later, Kevin called to accept option 3. His investment loss had been a powerful catalyst, but I sensed something more in his decision. Perhaps genuine curiosity, or the competitive desire not to be outdone by his sister, or simply the realization that his quick money approach had failed spectacularly. By this point, Melissa was deep into her foundation work, already showing remarkable aptitude for community engagement and project evaluation. I arranged for Kevin to follow a different track, focusing on our healthcare initiatives, where his medical background might provide valuable insight. Only Jason remained distant. The few times I attempted to call, my messages went unreturned. Through Melissa, I learned he had used his $2 million to expand his business and purchase a vacation home in Florida. He told his siblings he wanted nothing to do with Mom's manipulative charity game. I respected his choice. Painful, though. It was. The options had been genuine, with genuine consequences. Meanwhile, I finally began living openly as myself. I renovated my kitchen and bathroom, modest upgrades I had long desired but denied myself for the sake of appearances. I replaced my old sedan with a comfortable luxury car, though nothing ostentatious. I donated my struggle wardrobe and purchased clothes that were well-made and classic rather than trendy or flashy. My neighbors noticed the changes, of course. Small towns always notice. I answered questions honestly but briefly, explaining that an investment had matured, allowing me some long-delayed improvements. Most seemed to accept this readily, though I occasionally caught speculative glances. 4 months into Melissa and Kevin's foundation year, I invited them both to dinner at my home, the first time all 3 of us would be together since the revelation. I prepared their favorite meals from childhood, not as manipulation, but as a reminder of the constants in our relationship. My love for them had never been part of the pretense. They arrived separately but within minutes of each other. Watching them enter my newly renovated kitchen, I saw them take in the changes, the quality granite countertops, the custom cabinets, the professional-grade appliances I had secretly wanted for decades. "This suits you," Melissa said, running, her hand along the countertop. "Beautiful but not showy." "Exactly what I wanted," I agreed, gesturing them to the table where I'd set out appetizers. "How are you both finding the foundation work?" What followed was the most engaging dinner conversation we'd had in years. Kevin described a rural healthcare initiative he was evaluating, his medical expertise providing insights the regular staff hadn't considered. Melissa spoke passionately about an affordable housing project she'd helped restructure to better serve families with disabilities. "The most remarkable thing," Kevin said, refilling his water glass, "is how far the money goes when it's deployed strategically. The rural telemedicine program costs a fraction of what my former practice spent on decorative artwork, but it serves thousands of patients who would otherwise go without care." "That's what Dad understood early on," I said quietly. "It's not about how much you have, but how thoughtfully you use it." Something shifted in Kevin's expression at the mention of his father. Did Dad really agree with this whole experiment? The pretending? I placed my fork down carefully. We discussed it extensively before his death. The principles, yes. He absolutely believed that character should precede wealth, that our children should develop values independent of financial advantage. The specific implementation? I smiled sadly. He died before we could fully determine that together. The exact form the approach took was my decision alone. "I've been angry about that," Kevin admitted, feeling like we were lab rats in some decades-long social experiment. "I understand that anger," I acknowledged. "It was never about experimenting on you, though. It was about giving you space to become yourselves without the distortion wealth can create. Whether I succeeded," I gestured between them, "is something you'll determine, not me." After dinner, as we moved to the living room with coffee, Melissa asked the question that clearly had been on both their minds. Have you heard from Jason? No, I said simply. He's made his choice, and I respect it, even while hoping it might someday change. He's going through a lot, Kevin said, surprising me with this defense of his brother. Regina is filing for divorce. This was news to me. I'm sorry to hear that. Apparently she's asking for half of everything, including the $2 million, Melissa added. Jason is not handling it well. I absorbed this information without comment. Jason's marital troubles weren't surprising. His relationship with Regina had always seemed based more on mutual materialism than deeper connection, but I took no satisfaction in his difficulties. As the evening wound down, I shared with them my plans for my home, not selling it as they had once insisted, but converting part of it into a meeting space for local nonprofits, while maintaining my private living area. Both seemed genuinely supportive of the idea. When they left that night, both hugged me warmly, the first genuine physical affection we'd shared since the revelation. Small steps toward healing, I hoped. The next morning, I had just finished breakfast when my doorbell rang. Opening it, I found myself face-to-face with Jason for the first time in 5 months. He looked haggard, his normally immaculate appearance rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I stepped aside wordlessly, leading him to the kitchen where the coffee was still warm. He sat heavily at the table, looking around at the renovations with a strange expression. "Nice kitchen," he said finally. "Thank you." "Regina's leaving me," he stated flatly. "Kevin mentioned it might be heading that way. I'm sorry." Jason laughed bitterly. "Are you? Isn't this exactly the kind of comeuppance your little morality play was designed to deliver? The materialistic, son loses everything." "I never wanted any of you to suffer, Jason," I said gently. "That was never the point." "Then what was the point?" he demanded, suddenly animated by anger. "Because from where I'm sitting, you deliberately watched us struggle for decades while sitting on a fortune that could have changed our lives." I poured him coffee, giving myself a moment to formulate a response that might actually reach him. "Do you remember when you were 16, I began, "and you begged your father for a car for your birthday?" Jason frowned at the apparent non sequitur. "What does that have to do with anything? He bought you a used Camry instead of the sports car you wanted. Do you remember what he told you?" "That I needed to learn responsibility before flash," Jason recited mechanically. "That a car was a tool, not an identity. And 2 years later, when you'd taken perfect care of that Camry, saved your own money, and demonstrated responsibility, he helped you buy something nicer." I paused, letting the parallel sink in. The principle was always the same, Jason, just on a much longer time frame and larger scale. Jason stared into his coffee. "It's not the same thing. We were adults, not children. You didn't have the right." "Perhaps not," I conceded. "But I had the responsibility to your father's memory, to the wealth he built, and to the children we both wanted to raise with values deeper than consumer culture teaches. Did I choose the right approach? I don't know. Would you and your siblings be different people if I had revealed everything after your father's death? Almost certainly. Better people? That I cannot say." We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Jason spoke again, his voice subdued. "Regina only wanted the money. The moment things got difficult, she was planning her exit strategy. 23 years of marriage, and all she could talk about was asset division." "I'm truly sorry," I said, meaning it. Whatever his flaws, Jason was my child, and his pain brought me no joy. "Kevin and Melissa say this foundation work has been meaningful for them," he said, the words clearly difficult to form. "That it's not what they expected." I nodded, not wanting to push. "I've lost nearly everything," Jason continued. "The business is struggling. The Florida house is part of the divorce settlement. The $2 million is half gone between Regina's claims and bad investments." He looked up, his expression raw with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a child. "Is that third option still available, even for me?" "It always has been," I replied quietly. The door never closed. The next day, I called Sophia at the foundation to arrange Jason's orientation. Unlike his siblings, he would start with our financial literacy program for low-income entrepreneurs, an area where, despite his current setbacks, his business experience might provide valuable perspective. With all 3 of my children now engaged in the foundation work, I felt a cautious optimism. They had each arrived via different paths: Melissa through genuine curiosity, Kevin through financial disaster, Jason through personal crisis. But they were all there, learning about the responsibilities of wealth rather than just its privileges. Over the next several months, I watched as they immersed themselves in different aspects of the foundation. Their weekly reports revealed growing understanding, occasional frustrations, and most encouragingly, evolving perspectives on money, privilege, and purpose. "I helped review scholarship applications today," Jason told me during one of our now regular Sunday dinners, 6 months into his program. "Reading their essays, these kids have overcome obstacles I can't even imagine, and they're so determined. I found myself getting emotional about it, which," he shook his head ruefully, "is not exactly on brand for me. Empathy is a muscle that grows with use," I offered. "Your father had an extraordinary capacity for it, though he didn't always show it openly." "I wish I'd known him better," Jason said quietly. "The real him, not just the careful engineer I thought he was." "He was both," I assured him. "The careful engineer who taught you to change oil and fix leaky faucets was entirely genuine. So was the visionary investor. People contain multitudes, Jason, even parents." As their foundation year approached its final months, I consulted with Sophia about the most appropriate next steps. The original agreement had specified assessment after 1 year, with the possibility of significant ongoing involvement with family wealth if they had genuinely engaged with the work. By any objective measure, all 3 had genuinely engaged, though in different ways. Melissa had shown remarkable aptitude for program development and community partnership. Kevin had leveraged his medical expertise to strengthen our healthcare initiatives. Jason, despite his late start, had brought valuable insights to our entrepreneurship program. But the question wasn't just about their professional contributions. It was about their personal transformation. Had they developed the character and perspective to handle wealth responsibly? Had my 40-year experiment, with all its flaws and unintended consequences, ultimately achieved its purpose? I decided the final assessment should involve a project of their own design. Each would identify a need related to their foundation, work and develop a comprehensive proposal for addressing it, including budget, timeline, impact measurements, and sustainability plan. They would present these proposals not just to me, but to the foundation's entire board of directors. "This isn't a competition," I clarified when I announced the assignment. "Each proposal will be evaluated on its own merits, not in comparison to the others. The goal is to demonstrate your understanding of thoughtful philanthropy and impact-focused wealth deployment." They had 1 month to prepare. During that time, I deliberately maintained distance from their process, wanting their work to truly reflect their own thinking rather than attempts to please me. The presentation day arrived in early fall, just over a year after my initial revelation about our family's wealth. The foundation's boardroom in Columbus filled with directors, accomplished professionals from various fields who had guided our work for years. These people knew me as Margaret Wilson, the philanthropist, not Margaret Wilson, the supposedly struggling widow, and they would evaluate my children's proposals with objective expertise. Melissa presented first. Her project focused on intergenerational housing communities that would combine affordable senior housing with subsidized apartments for young families. creating mutually supportive environments where seniors could avoid isolation while young families gained surrogate grandparents and assistance with childcare. The financial model included innovative public-private partnerships and a revolving loan fund that would make the program self-sustaining after initial investment. Kevin followed with a proposal targeting the healthcare workforce shortage in rural areas through a combined education subsidy and practice establishment program. Medical, nursing, and allied health professionals would receive substantial education funding in exchange for rural service commitments, while also receiving turnkey support for establishing practices in underserved communities. His detailed analysis of healthcare economics showed potential systemic impact beyond the individual practitioners supported. Jason presented last, clearly nervous but well prepared. His proposal addressed small business development in declining industrial towns, combining capital access, mentorship, and market connection support for entrepreneurs committed to community revitalization. Having experienced business success and failure himself, his approach showed nuanced understanding of both the practical and psychological barriers entrepreneurs face in struggling communities. As I listened to each presentation, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: professional admiration for the quality of their work, maternal pride in their growth, and a bittersweet acknowledgement that perhaps, if I had involved them in the family's philanthropy earlier, we might have avoided years of estrangement and misunderstanding. The board's questions were rigorous and sometimes challenging, but all three handled them with thoughtful consideration rather than defensive reactions. Itself, a sign of significant personal growth. When the formal presentations concluded, the board moved to closed session for deliberation, while my children and I waited in a separate conference room. "That was intense," Jason said, loosening his tie. "Tougher than any business pitch I've ever made." "The stakes feel different when it's about impact rather than profit," Melissa observed. "At least they did for me." Kevin nodded agreement. "When Dr. Franklin questioned my rural retention projections, I realized I wasn't just defending numbers. I was advocating for communities I've actually visited, people I've met during site assessments." I listened to their conversation with quiet satisfaction. They were discussing substance, not superficial outcomes. They were thinking about people beyond themselves. This, more than any presentation polish, was what I had hoped to cultivate. When the board completed their deliberations, we returned to the boardroom. Sophia, as executive director, addressed us. "The board has thoroughly evaluated each proposal according to our standard criteria: feasibility, potential impact, sustainability, and innovation," she began. All three presentations demonstrated remarkable thought and preparation, particularly considering the presenter's relatively recent involvement in philanthropic work. She proceeded to provide specific feedback on each proposal: strengths to leverage, weaknesses to address, questions to explore further. There was no ranking, no winner declared. Instead, all three proposals were deemed worthy of continued development with appropriate mentorship and refinement. "And now," Sophia concluded, "I'll turn the floor over to Mrs. Wilson for the final assessment regarding her family arrangement." All eyes turned to me. This was the moment my children had been working toward for a year: my evaluation of whether they had genuinely engaged and therefore qualified for significant ongoing involvement with family wealth. I looked at each of my children in turn, seeing not just who they were now, but who they had been, as children full of potential, as young adults finding their way, as middle-aged people confronting difficult truths about themselves and their upbringing. "When your father and I discussed our hopes for your future," I began, "we talked not about specific achievements or career paths, but about character. We hoped you would develop compassion, responsibility, purpose, and perspective, regardless of financial circumstances." I gestured to their presentation materials, still displayed on the boardroom screens. What I've witnessed over this past year, culminating in today's presentations, suggests that those qualities have indeed developed, perhaps later than I had hoped, and through a more difficult path than any of us might have wished, but genuinely and deeply nonetheless. I opened the folder in front of me, removing 3 identical documents. These outline the next phase of our family's relationship with wealth. Each of you will receive trusts providing substantial annual income. Each of you will have the opportunity to direct a significant portion of the foundation's annual grant-making, and each of you will receive a seat on this board, with full voting rights and responsibilities. I place the documents before them. However, there are conditions. The trusts include ethical use provisions. The grant-making requires accountability, measures. The board positions demand active, informed participation. In other words, the wealth comes with responsibility, as it always should. "And if we don't agree to these conditions?" Kevin asked, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than rejection. "Then we return to option 1 or 2, I replied simply. "This isn't an ultimatum, it's a framework for moving forward in a way that honors both your autonomy as adults and the purpose this wealth can serve beyond personal consumption." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Melissa reached for her document, followed quickly by her brothers. As they reviewed the detailed provisions, I saw thoughtful consideration rather than greedy calculation in their expressions, itself evidence of how far they had come. "I think Dad would approve of this," Melissa said finally, looking up from the papers. "I believe he would," I agreed. As we left the foundation offices that afternoon, walking together toward the parking lot, Jason asked the question that had likely been on all their minds. "Was it worth it, Mom? All those years of pretending? The distance it created between us?" I paused, considering his question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know if it was worth it," I answered honestly. "I know only that it was the path I chose, believing it to be right at the time. There's no parallel universe where I can see how you all might have developed with a different approach." I looked at my 3 adult children, accomplished in their fields, humbled by recent experiences, still evolving in their understanding of wealth and its purpose. But I do know this. The people standing before me today are thoughtful, capable stewards of resources that can create meaningful change in the world. And that was always my deepest hope. As we reached our cars, we made plans for a family dinner. The following weekend, not at my modest home this time, but at the Foundation's retreat center, where we would begin the process of collaborative family philanthropy that had been Richard's dream 4 decades earlier. Driving home alone, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. My 40-year experiment had not gone as planned. It had caused pain I never intended, created distance I deeply regretted, and perhaps delayed my children's development rather than enhancing it. Yet, as imperfect as my approach had been, we had ultimately arrived at a place of genuine understanding. My children now knew not just the extent of our family's wealth, but its purpose and potential. They had begun to grasp the responsibility that accompanies privilege, and most importantly, they were developing their own authentic relationship, with money as a tool for impact rather than a measure of worth. That night, in the home that had witnessed decades of my carefully maintained pretense, I opened the safe hidden behind my bedroom bookshelf. Inside was a letter Richard had written me the day before his death, never knowing it would be his final communication. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "today marks the achievement of our financial goals, but what matters far more is the achievement of our deeper purpose, raising children who understand that wealth is meaningful only when deployed, with wisdom, compassion, and vision. However you choose to guide them in my absence, trust your judgment. You have always seen clearly what matters most." I carefully refolded the letter, returning it to its place. Richard could never have anticipated the precise path I would choose or its complex consequences. But looking back on the tumultuous year since revealing the truth to our children, I believed we had finally begun to fulfill his deepest hope, that the wealth he built would serve a purpose beyond itself, guided by the values we had both held. Dear, tomorrow would bring new challenges in our family's evolving relationship with money and meaning. But for the first time in 40 years, those challenges would be faced together, with honesty rather than pretense as our foundation. 1 year after my children learned the truth about our family's wealth, I sat on the patio of my newly renovated home, watching the autumn leaves drift across the garden Richard and I had planted decades ago. So much had changed, yet this space remained a constant, though now the cracked concrete had been replaced with elegant flagstone, and the weathered garden furniture with pieces both beautiful and durable. The sound of car doors slamming announced my children's arrival for our monthly family foundation meeting, a tradition established after they completed their initial year of foundation work. These gatherings combined foundation business with family reconnection, a deliberate weaving together of the financial and personal legacies I hope to leave them. "The roses look spectacular, Mom," Melissa observed as they joined me on the patio. At 56, my daughter had blossomed into a confident woman whose once highlighted hair was now allowed to show natural silver at the temples. The anxious need to maintain appearances that had characterized her earlier years had been replaced by a comfortable authenticity. "The landscaper you recommended did beautiful work," I acknowledged, pouring coffee from the carafe I'd prepared. "How's the Riverside project coming along?" Melissa had taken leadership of our affordable housing initiative, applying her natural organizational skills to community development rather than the endless house renovations that had once consumed her resources. "We're breaking ground next month," she said, pride evident in her voice. The city council finally approved the zoning variance. Kevin arrived next, his medical precision making him habitually prompt. At 53, he still carried himself with the authority his cardiology career had instilled, but the aggressive edge that once accompanied it had softened. "Traffic was surprisingly light," he commented, accepting coffee and declining pastries. Some habits remained unchanged. "I've been reviewing the rural telemedicine data you sent, Mom. The outcomes are even better than projected." Last came Jason, now 58, who had perhaps changed the most visibly. Gone was the designer wardrobe and status-conscious persona. His clothing was still well-made but understated, his manner more thoughtful. His divorce from Regina had finalized 6 months ago, leaving him chastened but ultimately liberated from a relationship built more on mutual materialism than genuine connection. "Sorry I'm running late," he apologized, settling into the remaining chair. "I was on the phone with the Pine Ridge program director. Their small business incubator just had their first successful graduate. I studied my 3 children as they exchanged updates about their various foundation projects." The transformation from that tense confrontation in my living room 18 months ago to this engaged, purposeful conversation still felt somewhat miraculous. Not perfect. We still had moments of tension, disagreement, and lingering resentment about the past, but real and evolving. After coffee, we moved inside to what had once been my formal dining room, now converted into a comfortable meeting space with a large table and technology for video conferencing. Sophia, our foundation's executive director, joined us virtually from the Columbus office. "Let's start with the quarterly financial overview," I suggested, bringing up the presentation on the large screen. For the next hour, we reviewed the foundation's activities, investments, and impact metrics. My children asked informed questions, suggested thoughtful refinements, and occasionally disagreed about priorities, exactly the kind of engaged governance every foundation hopes for. What struck me most was how they had each found their authentic connection to the work. Melissa's passion for creating dignified housing communities leveraged her natural empathy and attention to detail. Kevin's healthcare initiatives reflected both his medical expertise and his growing understanding of systemic barriers to care. Jason's entrepreneurship programs combined his business acumen with a hard-earned appreciation for both success and failure. As our formal meeting concluded, Sophia signed off, and I transitioned to the more personal portion of our gathering. I have something important I'd like to discuss with you, I began, bringing out a leather portfolio I'd prepared. As you know, I'm turning 80 next month. We haven't forgotten, Mom, Melissa smiled, though you still won't tell us what you want for your birthday. Actually, this is about that, I replied. I've been reflecting on what I want the next chapter of my life to look like. I opened the portfolio, revealing architectural drawings. I've decided to donate our family home to the foundation to be converted into a community center for seniors and a headquarters for our local programs. They studied the renderings with interest rather than the shock or objections such an announcement might have provoked 2 years earlier. Where will you live? Kevin asked practically. I turned to the next page, showing plans for a beautiful but modest cottage to be built at the back of the property, overlooking the garden. I'll retain a life estate in this portion, I explained, close enough to remain connected to the community work, but with the privacy and accessibility I'll need as I continue to age. This is brilliant, Mom, Jason said, examining the drawings more closely. The main house is too large for one person, but repurposed like this, it serves a genuine need in the neighborhood. The seniors who come for programs could help maintain the garden, Melissa added, immediately grasping the intergenerational potential. It would give them purpose and connection. I felt a surge of gratitude at their understanding. 2 years. Ago, they had tried to force me into an assisted living facility for my own good. Now they appreciated that I could make thoughtful decisions about my future while simultaneously creating community benefit. There's something else, I continued, turning to the final pages in my portfolio. I've been working with David Goldstein on an updated estate plan. Their attention sharpened, though not with the naked calculation such an announcement would once have triggered. The foundation will continue to receive the majority of our family wealth, I explained. But I've created new personal trusts for each of you that will provide significant support for your own philanthropic interests beyond the foundation's formal work. I handed each of them a folder with details of their individual trusts. These are designed to support your direct giving in areas you care about without the formal processes the foundation requires. Consider it your personal philanthropic laboratory. They reviewed the documents with thoughtful interest rather than immediately checking the dollar amounts, another small but meaningful sign of their evolution. I'm also establishing dedicated funds for each of my grandchildren, I continued. Not trust funds that will give them wealth without purpose, but structured resources that will support their education and then match their charitable giving as young adults, helping them develop their own philanthropic identities. That's wonderful, Mom, Melissa said. Emily has already been asking about getting more involved after helping with the Riverside Community Outreach Day. Which brings me to my birthday request, I said, bringing the conversation full circle. What I want, more than anything, is a family legacy letter from each of you. A what? Jason asked. A letter expressing what you've learned about wealth, purpose, and family through this journey we've been on, I explained. Not just for me, but to be shared with your children, and eventually their children, wisdom that can guide future generations of our family. Kevin looked skeptical. You want us to write about how you deceived us for 40 years and what we learned from it? His tone held a touch of the old bitterness that occasionally resurfaced. I met his gaze steadily. I want you to write honestly about your entire experience, including your anger, disappointment, and any lingering resentment. This isn't about creating a sanitized family mythology. It's about authentic reflection on a complicated legacy. The tension eased from Kevin's shoulders. I can do that. This is actually perfect timing, Melissa said. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to tell Emily about our family history. The real history, not just the wealth part. As they prepared to leave a few hours later, each with foundation assignments and birthday letter reflections to consider, Jason lingered behind. "Can we talk privately, Mom?" he asked once his siblings had departed. We settled in the living room, the space where our family secret had first been revealed in such dramatic fashion 18 months earlier. "I've been offered a position," Jason began, uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "The Small Business Administration wants me to lead a new initiative supporting entrepreneurship in economically distressed communities. It would mean moving to Washington." "That sounds like a remarkable opportunity," I said, genuinely pleased. "Your foundation work has prepared you well for that role." "That's just it," he continued. "Everything I've learned this past year about effective community investment, about the real challenges small business owners face in struggling areas. It's exactly what this position needs. But it would mean stepping back from my foundation responsibilities here." I understood his concern. After spending a year earning his place in our family philanthropy, he worried about appearing to abandon it. "Jason, the foundation work was never meant to be a prison," I said gently. "It was meant to be preparation for thoughtful engagement with wealth and its possibilities. If this role allows you to expand that impact to a national scale, that's a success, not a failure." Relief washed over his face. "I was worried you'd see it as rejecting everything we've built this past year." "Quite the opposite," I assured him. "This is exactly the kind of purposeful work the foundation experience was meant to inspire. The only question is whether it feels right to you." "It does," he said with conviction I hadn't often heard from him before our reconciliation. "For the first time in my career, I feel like I'll be building something meaningful beyond my own balance sheet." After Jason left, I walked through my home, the home that would soon transform into a community space while I transitioned to my garden cottage. Every room held memories. Richard teaching the children to play chess in the living room, homework sessions at the kitchen table, holiday gatherings in the dining room. But homes, like family legacies, weren't meant to be preserved in amber. They evolved to serve new purposes while honoring their foundations. The transformation of this house into a community resource felt like the perfect metaphor for what I hoped our family wealth would continue to do: retain its core values while adapting to serve evolving needs. My 80th birthday celebration was deliberately modest, family gathering at the Foundation's retreat center rather than an ostentatious party. My grandchildren attended, now young adults beginning to grasp the complexity of their family's unusual history. After dinner, my children presented me with a beautifully bound book containing their legacy letters, each reflecting their unique perspective on our journey. Melissa's letter traced her evolution from a woman who had sold her wedding ring to cover a mortgage payment to someone who now helped create housing security for hundreds of families. "I resented your deception for many years," she wrote with unflinching honesty. "But I've come to understand that without it, I might never have discovered the satisfaction of purpose beyond possession. The struggle itself wasn't necessary. We could debate that forever. But the perspective it eventually granted has been invaluable." Kevin's contribution was characteristically direct, acknowledging the anger he had harbored while also reflecting on its transformation. "Learning that I'd been living a life founded on incomplete information shook my fundamental trust," he wrote. "Yet practicing medicine had already taught me that sometimes patients need information provided in stages when they're ready to process it." Was I ready at 17 to handle significant wealth responsibly? Absolutely not. At 52? Questionable, as my investment disaster proved. The timing may not have been perfectly executed, but the intention, to develop character before access to resources, was fundamentally sound. Jason's letter surprised me most with its depth of reflection. I spent decades pursuing external markers of success, he admitted, collecting possessions, achievements, and even relationships as evidence of my worth. The revelation of our family's wealth initially felt like confirmation that all that striving had been unnecessary, a cruel joke at my expense. What I've since come to recognize is that the revelation itself wasn't what mattered. It was the invitation that came with it, to discover purpose beyond accumulation. That invitation, not the money, was the true inheritance. Each letter also contained direct messages to future generations of our family, wisdom hard-earned through our complicated journey. Question the stories you're told, even by those who love you, Melissa advised her descendants. Not because they're necessarily intended to deceive, but because all narratives contain perspective and purpose that may not be immediately evident. Wealth without purpose becomes a burden rather than a blessing, Kevin wrote. Find what gives your life meaning independent of financial resources, then deploy those resources in service of that meaning. Failure has been my greatest teacher, Jason reflected. Don't protect future generations from the valuable lessons that come from struggle, but be present to help them extract wisdom rather than bitterness from difficult experiences. Reading their words, I felt the complex emotions of a mother who had made imperfect choices with good intentions. Had my 40-year experiment in character development been the right approach? There was no simple answer, and their letters acknowledged that complexity rather than offering neat conclusions. What mattered most was that we had, at last, arrived at a place of honest reckoning with both the failures and successes of my approach. The wealth itself had proven less important than the values that guided its use, just as Richard and I had hoped all those decades ago. A month after my birthday, construction began on both the community center conversion and my garden cottage. I found myself spending hours watching the transformation, fascinated by how spaces could be reimagined while honoring their history, another apt metaphor for our family's journey. Melissa took the lead on the community center development, working closely with neighborhood seniors to ensure the space would truly serve their needs. Kevin established a health screening program that would operate from the new center once monthly. Even Jason, now splitting his time between Washington and his foundation responsibilities, contributed by designing a business mentorship program that would connect retiring professionals with aspiring entrepreneurs from the community. My grandchildren began engaging more actively as well. Emily, Melissa's daughter, now 28, took particular interest in the foundation's educational initiatives, leveraging her experience as an elementary school teacher. Kevin's twins, both in medical school, participated in our healthcare program planning during their breaks. Even Jason's son Michael, who had initially been the most skeptical about the family's secret philanthropy, began volunteering with our entrepreneurship programs. As spring arrived and my garden cottage neared completion, I found myself reflecting on the full circle of our family's journey. The modest home where I had raised my children pretending financial limitation would soon become a community resource, while I transitioned to a new space that reflected my actual values. Beautiful, but not excessive, designed for accessibility, as I aged, connected to community rather than isolated by wealth. One evening, as I boxed books in preparation for my move, I came across photo albums from the children's early years. Page after page showed birthday parties with homemade cakes, Christmas mornings with thoughtful but not extravagant gifts, family, camping trips rather than luxury vacations. Had I been wrong to raise them with those experiences rather than the privileged upbringing our wealth could have provided? There was no simple answer. Those experiences had shaped them in ways both positive and problematic, teaching resilience and practicality, while perhaps also installing chips on shoulders and tendencies toward material insecurity that manifested in different ways in adulthood. What I knew with certainty was that the revelation of our wealth, painful though it had been, had ultimately created opportunity for authentic connection and purpose that might never have developed otherwise. The crisis had forced genuine reckoning with values, priorities, and the meaning of legacy beyond financial inheritance. The day I moved into my garden cottage coincided with the community center's opening ceremony. Rather than separating these milestones, we deliberately combined them. My transition to a new chapter of life integrated with the community celebration of a new neighborhood resource. neighbors who had known me for decades as the modest widow. Librarian now understood more of my story, though not its complete complexity. I had shared enough to explain the transformation of my home without unnecessarily complicating community relationships with full disclosure of my 40-year pretense. Some secrets could remain family matters. The center opened with a ribbon cutting attended by local officials, neighbors, and of course, my family. 3 generations now standing together with a shared understanding of our unusual legacy. My grandchildren helped lead tours of the new facilities, proudly explaining how each space would serve community needs. My cottage, connected to the main property by a garden path yet clearly a private residence, struck the perfect balance between engagement and independence. Floor to ceiling. Windows overlooked Richard's rose garden, now restored to its former glory. Accessibility features were integrated seamlessly into beautiful design. The space was modest by wealthy standards, but perfectly suited to my needs and values. That evening, after the celebration concluded, my children and grandchildren gathered in my new living room for a private family moment. I had prepared a small gift for each of them, antique keys mounted in shadow boxes. "These are the original keys to this house," I explained, "the home where our family's complicated story unfolded. I wanted each of you to have one as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" asked Michael, Jason's son, who at 25 still carried some of his father's skepticism but was softening through his foundation involvement. "That access and entrustment are earned through character, not automatically granted through relation," I replied. "That what appears locked away may be preserved for purpose rather than withheld from spite. That keys, like wealth, are merely tools, their value determined entirely by how they're used." My oldest grandchild, Emily, studied her shadow box thoughtfully. "Grandma, if you could go back and do things differently, would you? Tell everyone about the money from the beginning?" The room quieted as everyone awaited my answer to this question that had undoubtedly lingered in all their minds. "I would have created more transparency sooner," I acknowledged after careful consideration. "The 40-year complete pretense was too extreme, creating unnecessary distance and preventing authentic family financial education. But the core principle, that character should develop before significant wealth access, I would maintain." I looked around at 3 generations of my family, seeing how far we had come from those tense early revelations. What I most regret isn't the principle behind my choices, but the loneliness of carrying such a significant secret alone for so many decades. Had your grandfather lived, I believe our approach would have evolved differently, with gradual disclosure and family engagement as you matured. "We can't change the past," Kevin said, the lingering edge in his voice softened by genuine acceptance, "but we can learn from it. That's what these legacy letters and this whole process has been about, hasn't it?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "And watching all of you engage with both our family history and its future possibilities gives me great hope that the lessons, however imperfectly delivered, have taken root." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my garden, cottage surrounded by carefully chosen possessions that represented my authentic self, rather than the financial pretense I had maintained for decades. Through the windows, I could see lights still glowing in the community center where evening programs were underway. The sound of laughter drifted through the spring air. On my desk sat the bound volume of legacy letters my children had created, alongside a framed photograph taken earlier that day. 3 generations of the Wilson family standing together on the steps of our new community center, expressions reflecting the complex journey we had traveled together. I thought about Richard, who had died at 45, never imagining the 4-decade experiment his death would inadvertently launch, never seeing how the wealth he had carefully built would eventually be deployed with purpose, never witnessing his children's complicated journey toward understanding the responsibility that accompanies privilege. Would he approve of how I had handled our family legacy? There was no simple answer, just as there was no simple verdict on whether my approach had been right or wrong. What mattered was that we had finally arrived at a place of authentic engagement, with both our financial resources and our family relationships. I had pretended to be broke for 40 years, revealing my true worth only when my children seemed to have abandoned the values their father and I had tried to instill. The revelation had been painful, disruptive, even traumatic. Yet from that disruption had emerged new understanding, purpose, and connection that might never have developed otherwise. As I prepared for bed in my new home, I placed Richard's final letter on my nightstand, the one he had written the day before his death, never knowing it would be his last communication. Its final lines had guided me through 40 years of difficult choices. Whatever path you choose for our family, Margaret, remember that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we understand about its purpose. May our children someday grasp this truth as deeply as we do. Looking out at the community center that had once been our family home, now illuminated and alive with purpose, I whispered into the quiet evening air, "I think they finally do, Richard. I think they finally do." The winter sun cast long shadows across the Wilson Community Center's Memorial Garden as Emily Parker, Melissa's daughter, now 38, carefully clipped the last of the season's roses. A decade had passed since her grandmother Margaret Wilson had moved into the garden cottage that stood at the edge of the property, and 5 years since Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85. Yet Margaret's presence remained palpable throughout the center that had once been the family home. From the carefully preserved library that still housed her collection of classic literature, to the community kitchen where she had taught neighborhood children, to bake during her final years, Emily placed the cut roses in her basket and made her way along the stone path toward the main building. The community center had evolved beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a vibrant hub that served multiple generations. Today's schedule included morning fitness classes for seniors, afternoon tutoring for local students, and evening financial literacy workshops for neighborhood residents. A diverse programming mix that reflected Margaret's vision of wealth as a tool for community empowerment rather than merely personal comfort. Inside, Emily found her cousin Michael, Jason's son, reviewing architectural plans in what had once been her grandmother's living room, now a multi-purpose meeting space. At 35, Michael had followed an unexpected path, leaving a promising career in finance to pursue community-focused urban planning. "The expansion plans look good," Emily commented, peering over his shoulder at the renderings. "Grandma would approve." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined standing in this house planning a community center expansion. I was still angry about the whole secret millionaire grandmother situation. Emily laughed softly. We all were, in different ways. Dad told me he didn't speak to Grandma for nearly a month after the big revelation. My dad was worse, Michael acknowledged. But look at us now. Their casual reference to the family's transformative revelation reflected how what had once been a shocking crisis had, over time, been integrated into their family narrative, not forgotten, but contextualized within a larger legacy story. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air as Kevin's twins, Sophia and Andrew, now accomplished physicians in their mid-30s, arrived for the quarterly Wilson Foundation meeting. Behind them came the rest of the extended family, Melissa, and Thomas, now reconciled after nearly divorcing during the turmoil of Margaret's revelation, Kevin and his second wife Grace, Jason, who had never remarried after his divorce from Regina, and various spouses and younger grandchildren. What had begun as a reluctant gathering of 3 adult children forced to confront their mother's decades-long deception had evolved into a purposeful family collaboration spanning 3 generations. The Wilson Foundation, once Margaret's secret project, now represented the combined vision of a family that had learned, through difficulty and ultimately wisdom, to deploy wealth with intention rather than ego. They gathered in the community center's conference room, formerly the family's formal dining room, where Margaret's portrait now hung alongside Richard's, a deliberate pairing that acknowledged their shared vision despite the very different paths their lives had taken. "Let's call this meeting to order," began Melissa, who at 66 had stepped into the role of foundation chair after Margaret's passing. Her once fashionable attire had been replaced by a style both professional and practical, reflecting her evolution from status-conscious consumer to community-focused leader. We have several important agenda items today, including the 10th anniversary celebration planning. As the family worked through foundation business, an observer would have noted how naturally leadership had distributed across generations. The original Wilson children, now in their 60s, provided historical perspective and governance oversight, while their children, all in their 30s and 40s, led program development and implementation. Even the youngest generation, teenagers and young adults, participated meaningfully, particularly in youth outreach initiatives. Next item, Melissa continued, is a proposal from the Education Committee regarding the Margaret Wilson Scholarship Program expansion. Emily, who chaired the Education Committee, presented the proposal with quiet confidence. "We've been working to address a gap in our scholarship model. While we've successfully supported high-achieving students from disadvantaged backgrounds, we've identified a need for targeted support of those facing midstream challenges." She distributed detailed documentation as she continued. "These are students who begin college with promise, but encounter obstacles that threaten their ability to continue, family health crises, financial setbacks, or unexpected caregiving responsibilities. Our data shows these situations disproportionately derail first-generation college students who lack family safety nets." What followed was a sophisticated discussion of intervention models, success metrics, and budget implications, exactly the kind of thoughtful wealth deployment that Margaret had hoped to see when she first established the foundation decades earlier. As the meeting progressed to community housing initiatives led by Michael, Kevin reflected silently on how dramatically his perspective had shifted in the decade since learning about his mother's wealth. His initial rage at being manipulated had gradually transformed into appreciation for the intentionality behind her approach, however imperfectly executed. His own financial disaster, losing nearly all of his $2 million inheritance in a fraudulent investment, had ultimately become a profound teacher, forcing him to reconstruct his relationship with money from first principles. Now, at 62, he understood wealth primarily as a mechanism for impact rather than a marker of personal success, a perspective that had transformed his medical practice and personal philanthropy alike. "Before we conclude," Melissa said, "as the meeting neared its end, I want to acknowledge an important milestone. This month marks exactly 10 years since Mom revealed the truth about our family's wealth, what we now somewhat humorously call the Great Unveiling. I think it's worth reflecting on how that moment, painful as it was, ultimately transformed our family in ways none of us could have anticipated." Jason, now 68 and recently retired from his SBA leadership role in Washington, spoke first. "I remember storming out of this very house, convinced I'd never speak to Mom again. I thought she'd robbed me of the life I deserved." He laughed softly at the memory. "What I couldn't see then was that she'd actually given me the opportunity to discover what deserving really means, that it's about stewardship and purpose, not entitlement. I was calculating how to invest my $2 million to maximize returns," Kevin admitted. "And we all know how that turned out. But losing that money was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront my relationship with success and status in ways I might have avoided otherwise." Melissa nodded. "Mom's approach wasn't perfect. We've all acknowledged that. The complete secrecy for 40 years created trust issues that took years to heal. But the core principle, that character should precede wealth, has proven itself in how we've evolved as a family." The conversation turned to the upcoming 10th anniversary celebration, which would include a community open house, the launch of a new foundation initiative, and a private family gathering to honor both Margaret's legacy and the journey they had traveled together. "We should include readings from the legacy letters," suggested Andrew, Kevin's son, now a dedicated rural physician whose practice embodied the values his grandmother had hoped to instill. "Not just Grandma's original letters to us, but the ones we've continued writing." This suggestion referenced a tradition Margaret had established before her death: annual letters reflecting on the family's evolving understanding of wealth, purpose, and legacy. These documents, shared only within the family, provided a chronicle of their collective journey from crisis to genuine collaboration. As the meeting concluded and family members dispersed to various parts of the community center, some to observe programs in action, others to continue private conversations, Emily found herself drawn to her grandmother's garden cottage, which had been preserved as a quiet retreat space and informal museum of family history. Inside, photographs documented the Wilson family's journey across generations. Margaret and Richard's early years in the modest home they had purchased while secretly building their fortune. The children growing up with no knowledge of their parents' wealth. The difficult period of revelation and reconciliation. And finally, the transformative decade that followed as 3 generations learned to steward resources with purpose. Emily settled into the window seat overlooking the winter garden, opening a leather-bound volume that contained the family's legacy letters. She turned to her grandmother's final letter, written just months before her death, its wisdom still providing guidance 5 years later. "As I approach the end of my life," Margaret had written, "I find myself reflecting on the 40-year experiment that defined so much of our family's journey. Was it right to conceal our wealth for so long? Was it wrong to create a fiction that delayed your understanding of your true inheritance? There are no simple answers to these questions, only the complex reality that intentions, however good, never unfold exactly as we anticipate. What I can say with certainty is that wealth without purpose becomes a burden rather than a blessing. Your grandfather understood this when he built our fortune quietly, prioritizing impact over recognition. I understood it when I made the imperfect decision to prioritize character development over financial disclosure. And most importantly, you, my children and grandchildren, have come to understand it through your own journeys of discovery. The true measure of my life's work is not the financial assets our family has accumulated, but the values that now guide their deployment. When I see 3 generations of Wilsons gathering not to divide spoils but to multiply impact, I know that despite my many mistakes, something essential was transmitted successfully across generations. May you continue to hold wealth as a tool, rather than a treasure, to value stewardship over ownership, and to measure success by contribution rather than accumulation. This, more than any financial inheritance, is the legacy I hope to leave." Emily closed the book as her mother, Melissa, joined her in the cottage. At 66, Melissa's face showed the lines of both struggle and joy, a visual testament to a life that had encompassed financial insecurity, marital challenges, and ultimately, purposeful leadership. "I find myself coming here when we have foundation meetings," Melissa admitted, settling beside her daughter. "Something about this space helps me reconnect with Mom's vision." "Was it strange?" Emily asked. "The transition from thinking of Grandma as the coupon-clipping librarian to seeing her as the sophisticated philanthropist she actually was?" Melissa considered the question thoughtfully. "It was disorienting at first, like discovering your entire family narrative had been built on a carefully constructed illusion. But looking back, I can see that she was always both of those people. The values she lived by as the struggling widow, careful stewardship, prioritizing needs over wants, finding meaning beyond material comfort, were the same values that guided her philanthropy. Do you think she regretted it? The deception? She regretted the distance it created," Melissa answered with certainty. "The trust issues it generated. but I don't think she regretted the underlying intention: to ensure we developed character independent of financial advantage. She smiled ruefully, though even she admitted that 40 years was probably excessive. Outside the cottage windows, they could see Jason working with a group of youth entrepreneurs in the center's business incubator space, college students from disadvantaged backgrounds developing small business plans under his mentorship. The scene embodied the transformation in Jason himself, from status-driven consumer to dedicated mentor, passing on both business acumen and deeper wisdom about success beyond financial metrics. 10 years ago, none of us would have predicted this, Melissa observed. Dad at peace with himself, genuinely invested in these young people's development. The family working together without the power struggles that marked those early foundation meetings, the community center thriving beyond even Mom's vision. Emily nodded. The great paradox of Grandma's revelation was that what initially felt like a profound betrayal ultimately created the opportunity for authentic connection with each other, with wealth's purpose, and with the legacy she and Grandpa hoped to create. As evening approached, family members began gathering for dinner in the community center's kitchen, a space now equipped for both teaching programs and family gatherings. The meal preparation was collaborative, with 3 generations working together, sharing the cooking wisdom that had passed from Margaret to her children and now to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Around the expanded table that accommodated the growing family, Kevin raised a glass. To Mom, whose unconventional methods ultimately led us here, and to Dad, whose vision of wealth with purpose set this entire journey in motion. The conversation over dinner reflected the family's evolution, substantive discussions of foundation initiatives interspersed with genuine interpersonal connection, the artificial divisions between family business and family relationship long since dissolved. After dinner, they moved to the center's library for a tradition Margaret had established in her final years. Readings from the family legacy letters, not as formal presentation, but as shared reflection, with family members selecting passages that held particular meaning. Michael, once the most skeptical of the grandchildren, chose a passage from Jason's letter written 5 years after the Great Unveiling. I spent decades chasing external validation through financial success, Jason had written, only to discover that the purpose-driven work I now undertake with the foundation provides satisfaction that no luxury purchase or status symbol ever delivered. The greatest gift from our family's unusual journey has been this opportunity to reconstruct my definition of success from first principles, to ask not, what can I acquire, but what can I contribute? Andrew selected words from his father Kevin's reflection at the 7-year mark. The physician in me recognizes that sometimes healing requires difficult intervention. Mom's approach, the 40-year deception followed by abrupt revelation, was like radical surgery without anesthesia. The process was traumatic, the recovery lengthy. Yet the outcome, our family's evolution from unconscious consumption to purposeful deployment of resources, represents a kind of healing that might not have occurred through gentler methods. Sophia, his twin, chose Margaret's own words from her final letter. My greatest hope for future generations of our family is not that they preserve or increase our financial capital, though thoughtful stewardship matters, but that they continue developing our moral capital, our intellectual capital, and our relational capital. True family wealth encompasses not just what we own, but who we are, what we know, and how we relate to one another and the broader community. As the evening wound down, the youngest generation, teenagers and young adults who had been small children or not yet born at the time of the Great Unveiling, asked questions about the family's unusual history. Their curiosity was met with honest reflection rather than simplified morality tales, acknowledging both the wisdom and the flaws in Margaret's approach. The most important thing to understand, Melissa explained to her 14-year-old granddaughter, is that wealth itself is neutral, neither inherently good nor bad. What matters is the consciousness we bring to it. Your great-grandmother was trying, in her imperfect way, to ensure that our family developed that consciousness before accessing significant resources. But wasn't lying wrong? The teenager asked with the direct ethical framing characteristic of her age. She didn't view it as lying, Jason interjected. She saw it as protecting us from a potential harm, the character distortion that sudden wealth can create, until we were ready to handle it responsibly. He smiled ruefully. Of course, her assessment of our readiness took several decades longer than any of us would have preferred. The truth is, Kevin added, none of us were particularly ready even as adults, as our initial reactions demonstrated. I demanded my inheritance immediately and promptly lost it in a bad investment. Your Uncle Jason used his for status purchases that brought little lasting satisfaction. Only your grandmother Melissa showed the wisdom to engage with the learning opportunity the foundation offered. The larger point, Emily concluded for her young cousin, is that there are no perfect answers in family wealth transitions. Every approach has strengths and weaknesses. What matters is the ongoing conversation about purpose, values, and impact. Exactly the conversation we're having right now. Later that night, after most family members had departed, Emily remained at the center, completing preparations for the next day's community programs. In the quiet building, she could almost feel the layers of history. The home it had been for generations, the battleground it became during the wealth revelation, and the community resource it had evolved into, embodying the family's transformed understanding of what wealth was truly for. Her phone chimed with a message from the Wilson Foundation's executive director, confirming details for an upcoming site visit to their rural healthcare initiative in Appalachia. The program, which had grown from Kevin's early foundation work, now served thousands of patients in medically underserved communities, combining healthcare access with economic development in a model being studied for potential national replication. As Emily responded to the message, she reflected on how thoroughly the Foundation's work had evolved in the decades since Margaret's revelation. What had begun as Margaret's personal philanthropy, shared only with trusted advisors, had transformed into a collaborative family enterprise integrating multiple generations' talents and perspectives. The Rural Healthcare Initiative embodied Kevin's medical expertise and newfound appreciation for systemic change over individual achievement. The Affordable Housing Program reflected Melissa's experience with housing insecurity and her natural talent for community building. The entrepreneurship initiatives carried Jason's business acumen, tempered by hard-earned wisdom about success, beyond financial metrics. Most importantly, the second and third generations had developed their own authentic connections to the work, extending beyond obligation or inheritance to genuine engagement. Emily's education initiatives, Michael's urban planning projects, Sophia and Andrew's healthcare innovations, all represented not deference to Margaret's legacy, but its organic evolution through new perspectives and changing social contexts. Emily made her final rounds of the building, checking that everything was secured for the night. In what had once been Margaret's study, now a reading room for community literacy programs, she paused before the family photograph that had been taken on the day the community center opened 10 years earlier. The image captured a pivotal moment in the Wilson family's journey, Margaret standing proudly before her former home as it began its new life as a community resource, surrounded by 3 generations still processing the dramatic revelation that had upended their understanding of their family narrative. Their expressions reflected a complex mixture of lingering confusion, tentative hope, and the first glimpses of new possibility. Beside this historic photo hung a more recent image, the entire family at the 5-year anniversary celebration, their faces now showing the integration and purpose that had developed through their collaborative work. The visual contrast told a powerful story of transformation, not just in individuals, but in a family system that had evolved from secrets and separate agendas to transparent purpose and shared vision. Emily's phone chimed again, a message from Michael asking if she could review his community housing proposal before the next committee meeting. The casual collaboration reflected how thoroughly their professional and family relationships had integrated over the past decade, creating partnerships that enriched both dimensions rather than forcing artificial separation between them. As she prepared to leave, Emily found herself drawn to Margaret's cottage one last time. In the small desk that had been her grandmother's, preserved exactly as she had left it, lay the journal Margaret had maintained throughout her life, from young wife helping her husband build a fortune in secret, to widow maintaining a 40-year pretense of modest means, to family matriarch navigating the aftermath of revelation. The journal's final entry, written just days before Margaret's peaceful death, had become something of a family touchstone. As I near the end of my journey, I find myself thinking of Richard and what he might make of the path our family has traveled. Would he approve of my 40-year experiment in character development? Of the revelation that came only when our children showed me who they had become? Of the decade of transformation that followed? I believe he would recognize, as I do, that there is no perfect approach to family wealth. Only imperfect humans doing their best to steward resources wisely across generations. Our approach was unusual, perhaps extreme in its duration and methods. Yet looking at our family today, 3 generations working collaboratively toward meaningful impact, I cannot help but feel that something essential was accomplished, however messy the process. The greatest wealth we leave behind is not financial but ethical. The values that guide deployment of resources toward purpose beyond self. In this, despite many mistakes along the way, I believe Richard and I can rest, knowing our deepest hopes for our family's legacy have been realized. To those who come after, hold lightly what you own, but firmly what you stand for. Measure success by contribution rather than accumulation. Remember always that wealth is merely potential until activated by purpose. This is the true inheritance. We hope to leave, not just assets to be managed, but wisdom to be lived. Emily carefully closed the journal, returning it to its place in the desk drawer. Outside the cottage windows, the community center still showed lights in some windows, evening programs continuing even after administrative staff had departed. The building itself embodying Margaret's vision of wealth activated by purpose. Tomorrow would bring the official beginning of the 10th anniversary celebration, a year-long series of events commemorating not just Margaret's revelation, but the transformative decade that had followed. Community open houses, foundation initiative, launches, and private family reflections would mark the journey from crisis to collaboration, from secrecy to shared purpose. As Emily finally left the center, she considered her own role in continuing the family legacy. At 38, she had developed a leadership voice within both the foundation and her professional field of education reform. Her approach reflected elements of Margaret's vision while incorporating her own generation's perspectives and the evolving social context of their work. The education initiative she would present at tomorrow's launch had been developed collaboratively across 3 generations of Wilsons, integrating Margaret's emphasis on character development, Melissa's focus on community integration, and Emily's own expertise in educational equity. The program embodied exactly the kind of cross-generational wisdom that Margaret had hoped would eventually emerge from her imperfect experiment. Driving home through quiet streets, Emily reflected on the full arc of her family's unusual story. Margaret's 40-year pretense of financial limitation, while extreme in both duration and method, had ultimately created the conditions for 3 generations to engage authentically with questions of wealth, purpose, and legacy. The painful revelation, what the family now somewhat humorously called the Great Unveiling, had forced a reckoning that might never have occurred through gentler methods. From that crisis had emerged new understanding, not just of their financial reality, but of the responsibility that accompanied it. Most importantly, the decades since had transformed what could have remained bitter estrangement into purposeful collaboration, not through artificial reconciliation that ignored legitimate wounds, but through the genuine healing that comes from shared work toward meaningful goals. As Emily pulled into her driveway, Her phone displayed one final message for the day: the family group chat confirming attendance for tomorrow's events. The casual coordination reflected how thoroughly foundation business and family relationship had integrated over the past decade, creating connection that encompassed both purpose and genuine affection. Tomorrow, 3 generations of Wilsons would gather to commemorate a journey none of them could have anticipated, from a deception maintained for 40 years to a truth that had ultimately set them all free, not just to access wealth, but to discover its purpose. The community center that had once been the family home would host both public celebration and private reflection, embodying the transformed understanding that wealth's true value lies not in private comfort, but in public contribution. Emily smiled as she entered her own home, modest by the standards her family's resources could afford, yet comfortable and welcoming. Her housing choice reflected the integration of Margaret's values with her own authentic preferences: appreciation for quality without attachment to status, comfort without excess, purpose without pretense. On her living room wall hung her own copy of Margaret's final legacy letter, framed alongside the family photographs spanning 4 generations of Wilsons. The juxtaposition captured exactly what Margaret had hoped to create: a family defined not primarily by financial inheritance, but by shared values that guided wealth's deployment toward purpose beyond self. "The inheritance is not the money," Margaret had written in that final letter. "The inheritance is the understanding of what money is for." 10 years after Margaret's revelation had upended their family narrative, that understanding had indeed become the true legacy. An inheritance far more valuable than the millions that had remained hidden for 4 decades, yet ultimately revealed not just their financial reality, but their capacity for growth, purpose, and genuine collaboration across generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.